In this video, we'll be making a tech pouch for your everyday carry. If you want to make your own, you can download the pattern and instructions at learnmyog.com. Let's get started. I've marked the placement points on the right side of the fabric, and I'm aligning my webbing handle. And then I'll go ahead and bar tack that in a couple locations to prepare this front piece. To make sure the webbing doesn't cause the front panel to warp, I put the little scissors here just to add a slack to the handle. You can use scissors or a pen, something just narrow to create some slack in that webbing. To join that section with the rest of the front panel, we align it on the short side, and we're going to sew down and pivot at the corner. And you'll see here, once I reach that pivot point, I sink my needle, and then I'm going to use my snips and make a very small relief cut, making sure I don't snip through the seam line. With that relief cut, you can pivot the panel, and it'll create a nice corner for you at that pivot point. And you'll do that 2 times to create that angled shape. Gives it a nice structured and modern take to one of these little pouches. We're going to make 2 near identical front linings, and the first thing to do is to sew the darts. There's 2 darts per front lining. So you line your 2 notches, and you're going to sew diagonally down towards the dart tip. Now remember, on the pattern I give you a drill mark, and you'll sew the dart tip about 1 centimeter past that drill point. You have 2 per panel, and on the right side it gives it just a 3D shape that matches the front shell. To make a little pen loop, I first put in a ball needle because this elastic is pretty tough to sew. I get skip stitches with anything other than a ball needle. And then again, using those placement points, I go ahead and sew it between those points, and then I'll flip it up and sew it again. That gives a nice clean finish for this elastic. Then I join that elastic just along the top edge, basting it, and I'll use my pen to size the loop that I want. And because this is elastic, you want it a little bit tighter than the pen itself. So I kind of shift it over, and then I'll sew a line separating those two loops there for pens. The top portion will be big for now because we haven't used the full seam allowance yet. Moving on to the inside panels, this is a stretch Lycra mesh. And because it's pretty tough to sew, I go ahead and use this double-sided basting tape. And I'll put that on one side to include down the center seam, which creates 2 pockets. And then we'll fold the Lycra mesh onto itself, sticking it to that basting tape. To reinforce the opening of these mesh pockets, I use this 1/2-inch flat elastic. And I'll just kind of feed that through the 2 layers so it's inside the mesh pocket itself. It gives it a nice kind of finished edge along the top. It keeps it from being a little too loose or rippling. And then I'm going to baste the pocket to the front lining, sewing right through the double-sided basting tape itself. And a little gathering here, if you get that, it's okay. These pockets will stretch out, and you want them to be a little loose anyways because you're going to be putting items into these pockets. Here I'm putting a little bit of tension on that elastic itself, not very much to warp the whole panel, but just enough to hold the top edge of the pockets kind of taut. And then I'm going to sew right down the center of the pocket. Now here you might get a little bit of stretch, and you see it starts bubbling up for me. So a tip is to use paper, or I'm using the strips of the backing from that double-sided tape. And I'm just placing it underneath the presser foot. Gives me a guide, but it also reduces the friction and prevents the fabric from stretching as you sew it. Here I'm doing the recording wings, and there's going to be 4 of these. And you just sew it right sides together, get that edge, and then you can finger press it, crease it, so that you get a nice edge as you fold it around itself. Now it's right sides out. And we're just going to do a basting stitch around 3 sides, not along the side that's already folded. And just going to edge stitch right around it. And those will be raw edges on 2 sides. Double check the alignment of your wings. You want to make sure those wings are not entering down into the curve. So they're shaped a little bit weird just to keep them out of those lower curves. And you'll pin them on and just match them up and then base stitch them to the edge, again staying well within the seam allowance for a basting stitch. And there's 4 of these total, so 2 on each side. With the linings and the front panels created, now we just put them wrong sides together, and we'll base stitch around the perimeter so that they form one panel. There I'm lining up the darts with the seams on the outside, and then I check my notches along the top and bottom edges. You really want to make sure all this is kind of even and straightforward so that your notches are usable in future steps. Then you'll just base stitch around the entire thing, creating that one single panel for future assembly. Here's another look at the 2 panels that are now joined. You can notice the orientation of those wings. And these are ready for assembly with the zipper here in a couple steps. For the slip pocket, it's the one panel that's got the notches on each side because it does look similar to the zipper pocket. I'll be using this Heat and Bond Ultra Hold to give it some rigidity. And this basically laminates the fabric to itself. It's a fusible web, so it's a paper-backed glue. And here I'm marking it to be 3/8 inch smaller than the panel so it stays out of my seam. After sewing that panel along the bottom edge with that 3/8 inch seam allowance, that panel should fit there without interfering with that seam. Now using a cool dry iron, you're going to adhere this adhesive to the wrong side of the fabric. And it really doesn't take very much heat, and you want to just be careful because the technical fabrics can melt. Then you'll remove the paper backing and you'll be able to adhere it later. So first here I'm letting it cool off pretty well. I'm going to remove that paper backing, and then you need to flip this panel to be right sides out so that the glue will be on the inside, and you could stick it to the other side of the raw fabric there. With it all kind of flattened out, I just run that dry heat over it again, and then I'll put it onto a hard surface rather than the towel that I'm ironing on here, just to make sure it's all nice and flat, and also to help it cool off. With that fusible web inside there, this really does create a nice firm panel, and it creates these little slip pockets on the zipper pocket. So I'm lining it to the right side of one of the zipper pockets and 3/4 of an inch up from the bottom, just so it stays out of my French seam. And I'm going to sew it along the 2 sides as well as down the center to create 2 little slip pockets that are nice for holding cables and small items that just need to help with a little organization inside the bag. I'm finding center there, and then I'm just going to sew right down the middle of it. The next series of steps are to create a zipper pocket. It's a simple little pouch pocket. So I'm just adding these zipper tabs to the end of the zippers to make sure they're finished on the inside. So I just folded the tab in half and sewed it with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I'm just sewing back over itself so I don't have to backstitch across the zipper. That reinforces the end. And be sure you install your zipper slider before doing the next zipper tab. With that on, you'll sew the second zipper tab on, and that'll create a non-separating zipper that you can use for your little pouch. Now we're just aligning the zipper right sides together with one of the zipper panels and aligning it along the center line. I do recommend you top stitch this. Most of the rest of the bag it's optional to top stitch things, but for these little pouches it does create a nice finish to that zipper. And then your other zipper panel, you just want to make sure that that 3/4 inch gap is along the bottom. So you'll be sewing the zipper panel opposite that 3/4 inch gap we created originally. And you'll just sew it right sides together to form the other side of that zipper panel with the slip pockets. So it's got a nice finished bottom. We're going to do a French seam. So you first put it wrong sides together, which is a little odd. So it's right sides out. And we're going to sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance right across the bottom. And then we'll turn the bag right sides together, so it's inside out, which is your normal kind of seaming technique. We'll finger press that, and then you'll sew it at a 3/8 of an seam allowance. So that 1/4 inch seam allowance is fully encased on the inside. All your raw edges are encased. You don't have to add any binding or anything like that. And creates a really nice finish on the inside of the bag. Now we're just going to base stitch the two sides. And again, I'm sewing at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, staying away from those teeth of the zipper. No point should you be sewing across these zipper teeth at this stage. And those external seams will be used in final assembly when we join it to the wings. So right now it's finished on the inside, but those seams are on the outside of the bag for later assembly. Working on the main zipper gusset panel, that first gusset, you're going to do all your marks on the wrong side of the fabric. And we're going to go ahead and cut it in half. And mine shifts here a little bit, but that's okay. Then you're going to join those with the zipper right sides together, just like you do every other zipper. So the zipper's now sewn in, and I'm going to go ahead and cut some grosgrain binding. And I'm going to finish the inside edge of the zippers. So all I'm doing here is covering my raw edge of the fabric and the zipper tape itself. I folded the grosgrain in half and creased it, and then I'm using a little magnetic seam guide as a backstop. And you're just going to sew that binding right onto the raw edge of that panel on both sides of the zipper. And it creates a really professional interior finish with no raw edges that can fray. Alternatively, you could go ahead and top stitch this panel. You could do that after binding it, or you can just skip the binding and top stitch it, especially if you're using technical fabrics that don't really fray very much. So this is just an easy way of applying the binding. You don't need any attachments or anything like that. You just crease it, fold it over the edge, and sew it on. I do that to both sides. You see it creates just a really nice finish there on the inside of the zipper. Grabbing two zipper pulls. My zipper is actually going to be a reverse coil, so the coils will be on the inside, the raw side of the fabric, or the wrong side of the fabric. So I'm just installing those, and that creates the modern appearance that you see on a lot of packs now, where the zipper coils are on the inside. And then for the ends of the gusset, you center align them. It's okay if these gussets are a little bit large because of using the seam allowance from the zippers. You can just trim them up later. So just center align both of them. We put the shell right sides together with the zipper, and then the lining will be right sides together with the opposite shell. So you're creating a sandwich here with the zipper between it, and the lining and the gusset themselves are right sides together with the zipper between them, as you can see here. Then we just sew that with a precise 3/8 inch seam allowance. With that seam sewn, you want to open this, double check your zipper sliders are installed, and you're going to place the zipper right sides together with the opposite side of that gusset. And then you kind of have to flip the panel and just rotate it around so that the lining is right sides together again with the other side. You'll see kind of what that looks like here in a moment once I've got it all kind of positioned. With those panels right sides together, sandwiching the zipper, then you're just going to go ahead and sew that 3/8 inch seam allowance again. With the gusset sewn to the zipper itself, you get a loop of fabric and zipper that's all finished and it's lined on the inside so you don't have any raw edges. To prepare for assembling it, the gusset is attached to the right side of one of your shell's front panels. And you want to make sure that you align your center line notches. And then here I'm cutting relief cuts for where the gusset's going to wrap around the tight corners. And that's just going to help me keep the seam allowance and reduce any gathering or puckers that you get. Those relief cuts really just help get around those tight corners. Then we're going to sew around the perimeter. And again, make sure you got it center aligned, and then I make sure that pen loop is out of the way, nice and flat, and I'm using the full seam allowance here. And then with an awl or scissors or screwdriver, I use that as just a tool to help make sure I get the perfect seam allowance, and that those relief cuts help me get all the way up into the tight turns. Use your notches and for alignment, just to make sure you get everything sewn in correctly without too many puckers. And you just sew around that perimeter. To sew the other side, it's helpful to open the zipper and get that all aligned. And then you'll sew around the perimeter again of the opposite side. To finish the inside of the bag, it is pretty important to apply the binding because it also adds structure to your bag. Here I'm using a machine setup with a folding attachment, and I'm using grosgrain ribbon. Herringbone tape would work better around these curves. If you want to do it by hand, you can do it the same way we did the zippers. You crease that binding in half and then pin it to the fabric, and then you sew it around. So that binding finishes the inside of the bag, and as I said, it adds structure to the shape of the bag. For installing that zipper pocket we made earlier to the wings for this accordion shape, you turn the bag to be right sides out, and then you pull the wings to the outside of the bag and sandwich your zipper pocket between them. So this is why we didn't use the full seam allowance and we left those exterior seams on the zipper pocket. So now we're going to sew it between the two wings right along that edge, and then we'll finish that edge with some bias tape or grosgrain ribbon. So now I'm going to use a zipper foot, and I'm going to sew right up against the teeth of the zipper. It should be right at your 3/8 inch seam, or just thereabouts. So you shouldn't have to sew across the teeth. If you do, just be careful. And you just sew that down. You can see there it creates a nice taut finish there. And then you pull the pocket to the other side on the outside of the bag, align it to the wings, and sew it again. So just make sure your wings and everything are all kind of in that right orientation so they create that accordion effect on the inside of the bag. So now with this raw edges exposed, we're going to go ahead and make some binding. I just take that lining fabric and I cut it about 2 inches wide and fold it in quarters. So it's about 1/2 inch wide at this point. And then I lay it over the top of that seam. And you can also fold down the top edge and tuck this existing seam into that fold. And that'll create a really nice finish that's visible when you open the bag. The bottom, I'm not worried about a raw edge because this fabric doesn't fray. If you're using a fabric that does fray, you can go ahead and fold it up just like we did the top and tuck that raw edge into it. And you can see there, that's the visible side. It's got a nice fold. You don't see any of the raw edges. And that's the tech pouch. It's an intermediate pattern that's available on learnmyog.com, so I hope you check it out. If you made it this far, remember to like the video, and I hope you make one of these for yourself or as a gift.